Chapter 1. Fireworks in Sydney. Christmas 2014 would not have been a happy time for Craig Wright. That October, the ATO issued preliminary findings following investigations into a host of his companies and discovered more irregularities than there would be Sydney barbecues on Christmas Day. The agency alleged that Wright's companies had tried to obtain over $20 million in tax rebates through fraudulent means, rebates that they'd understandably withheld. Starved of their only means of income, the companies were left on the verge of bankruptcy. Indeed, by late 2014, some had already entered the liquidation process. That wasn't all, however. The ATO also alleged that Wright himself had backdated invoices and lied about everything from the existence of supercomputers to receiving $60 million worth of software from a noted fraudster. The agency also denied the existence of the Seychelles Trust, later named the Tulip Trust, that had supposedly supplied the mountain of bitcoins Wright allegedly used to purchase all his wares. In its eviscerations of Wright's supposed commercial activities, the ATO formally stated its belief that the companies were doing no actual work and that tax rebates formed 94% of their income. These reports also detailed Wright's attempts to get his ever-changing stories straight as the investigations progressed. But his attempts only served to make things worse. The entities were hit with provisional penalties and back taxes approaching $10 million, money that neither he nor they possessed. This was on top of his mounting legal bills, which urgently needed paying, with Wright all too aware that if Clayton Utz pulled out, he would be left to face the ATO alone. Having recovered every penny from behind the sofa, Wright had come to the realization that help from outside sources was likely to be his only possible avenue of escape. So Craig contacted me, I'm going to say late 2014, and I was surprised because I asked him how he got my mobile number. The person on the other end of the phone was Stephen Matthews, at that time the Philippines-based Chief Technology Officer for executive coaching company Taish Consulting. Wright and Matthews had worked together in the early to mid-2000s, with Wright allegedly showing Matthews a precursor copy, or copies, if Wright is to be believed, of the Bitcoin white paper before its publication in October 2008. As we examined in Volume 1, these claims are riddled with inconsistencies and were summarily dismissed by the judge in the Cryptocurrency Open Patent Alliance, COPA v. Wright case, Mr. Justice Meller. Matthew's story, first told in a May 2021 interview with a Wright supporter, was that Wright's late 2014 phone call had come out of the blue, with Matthews having not spoken to him for 2 to 3 years. Here, however, we note the first of many discrepancies with Matthews' timeline. A December 2016 information memorandum for Wright's future employer nChain states that the contact had, in fact, been frequent between 2011 and 2014. Over the years leading up to 2015, Dr. Wright continued his contact with Mr. Matthews about the research which he was now undertaking into Bitcoin and blockchain technology, and this contact became more focused as the De Morgan Group liquidity issues became pressing. In his May 2021 interview, Matthews didn't divulge what he and Wright discussed over the phone, but it led to their meeting in Sydney, where Wright was based, on an unspecified date. During this meeting, Wright supposedly told Matthews that he had a number of personal issues on which he needed Matthews' advice, with Matthews telling Wright that he was due back in Sydney again in a couple of months to sign some divorce papers. This led to a second meeting, where, over lunch and then dinner, the pair discussed, in Matthews' words, the whole Bitcoin journey and where it had been and where it was, in addition to Wright's tax issues. Matthews told his interviewer that when Wright asked for help, he, in turn, asked the magic question of what Wright actually wanted to do with his life. Wright responded that he was no good at running companies and that he wanted a position where his job was to create things and have other people take care of the business side. Matthews was invited to tell his story again a few weeks later in June 2021, which he did, but with some crucial differences. This time around, Matthews said that Wright's Christmas 2014 phone call was the first contact the pair had had since Matthews had left London in 2010, extending the period of non-communication from 2 to 3 years to 4. He also gave more details about what the call had involved, saying that Wright had used the reconnection to pour out his concerns over some issues in Australia on which he needed advice, a conversation Matthews previously said didn't take place until the first meeting sometime later. The reason for this shift soon became clear. In this second interview, Matthews completely scrapped the first meeting, claiming that the phone conversation had led straight to the lunch and dinner engagement. This took place 5 to 6 weeks after the phone call, placing it between the last week in January and the first week in February 2015, when Matthews had to be in Sydney to sign his divorce papers. I did my business in the morning, we met for a hamburger at lunchtime, and I invited him for dinner that night, and we talked until about 11 o'clock. Matthews also changed the nature of the dinner conversation in this second interview, saying that, far from the pair discussing the recent history of Bitcoin, they had, instead, talked about Wright's tax difficulties. Again, he reported asking Wright the magic question of what he actually wanted to do with his life, eliciting the same response. Matthews got a chance to clear up his chronology 6 months later in a third interview, but, alas, he only succeeded in sowing further confusion. Matthews stated that he had met Wright for lunch 3 or 4 weeks after the December 2014 phone call, up to a month earlier than his prior claim, when he was in Sydney to sign his divorce papers. In this third interview, Matthews again claimed that the meeting saw him and Wright discussing Wright's problems and issues rather than anything to do with Bitcoin, and failed to mention any dinner engagement. At this point, we can turn to a piece on the pro-Wright propaganda outlet CoinGeek, entitled How Bitcoin Was Saved. This piece, published 8 months after Matthews' third interview, attempted to clarify the situation that had become rather messy thanks to Matthews' changing story, but with little success. Given that Matthews would be testifying on his story with Wright in the upcoming Granath v. Wright trial, it was important to get the story ironed out once and for all. CoinGeek undermined Matthews' revised June and November 2021 interviews by massively downplaying the importance of the December 2014 phone call. In the new telling, Wright had simply heard that Matthews was going to be in Sydney for New Year's Eve and wanted to take the opportunity of his visit to have a chat, not stipulating any specific topic of discussion. CoinGeek also reinstated the first meeting, which it pegged to the 2nd of January 2015, much earlier than any of Matthews' existing timelines, and described what happened. On January 2nd, 2015, they met in a Sydney hotel lobby, where Matthews said Wright talked non-stop about Bitcoin's progress in the 6 years since its launch. This tallied with Matthews' comments in his first interview, but not his other two, showing yet further inconsistencies. Under examination during the Granath v. Wright trial, Matthews incredibly offered yet another take on events, introducing a new attendee and changing the nature of the conversation. I'd say it probably lasted about an hour and a half. We talked about people, we talked about our past. We didn't get into a lot of detail about Bitcoin at all, although Craig's wife brought Bitcoin up once or twice in the conversation, but I didn't pick up on it, just passed it off. I had no interest in picking up on it. Suddenly, Wright's wife, Ramona Watts, was present at the meeting too. Not just that, she was the main instigator of the Bitcoin conversation, a topic Matthews had supposedly wanted nothing to do with. Not only was this completely different to everything Matthews had said to date, but it also undermined another claim he had started making around this time, that he'd known about Wright's supposed creation of the cryptocurrency as far back as 2008. For the subject to suddenly be verboten was, therefore, peculiar in the least. Matthews was pressed on this point by Coper's barrister Jonathan Hoff KC during the Coper v. Wright trial, with Matthews responding that he wasn't interested in having a discussion about something I'd passed on years before, referencing his alleged rejection of the chance to subsidise Wright's Bitcoin work in 2008. Faced with a meeting it had, for some reason, reintroduced, CoinGeek then swept it unceremoniously under the rug, positing that the 2nd of January 2015 meeting seemingly held no purpose and left Matthews wondering at its pointlessness. This, as we know, is also problematic for Matthews. According to his first interview, it was this very meeting that led to the May lunch and dinner engagement, imbuing it with an importance CoinGeek was now keen to hide. How, then, did CoinGeek handle its suggestion that a pointless meeting in January led to a much more fruitful one 3 months later? The answer was the crowbarring in of another phone call from Wright to Matthews, where Wright supposedly let on for the first time that he might be in a spot of bother. Wright had hit a brick wall with the ATO over his claims for research grants under the government's Oz Industry programme, and the relationship with the taxman had become toxic at best. Of course, Matthews had been saying for 6 months that this conversation had happened as far back as December 2014, but by this point, those interviews weren't worth the bandwidth space they occupied. Matthews' news story for the CoinGeek piece was that the pointless January 2015 meeting had led to a period of silence between him and Wright, with Wright reaching out in April where the lunch and dinner engagement was arranged. This engagement, Matthews said, would be timed to coincide with an existing trip to Sydney to sign his divorce papers, a process that appeared to be as malleable as his meeting with Wright. With his hand perhaps now forced, Matthews stuck with this version of events for his Granath Wright testimony in September 2022. There had been a pointless 2nd of January 2015 meeting, an April phone call, and a lunch and dinner engagement a few weeks afterwards. In backing up CoinGeek's claim over the 2nd of January 2015 meeting, which he had discarded after his first interview, Matthews gave a reason why he was sure it had taken place after all. "I had my partner, now my wife, with me. We stayed in a hotel in North Sydney, and it was the first time I've ever seen Sydney fireworks for New Year's Eve live." In addition to recounting this memorable event, Matthews also testified during the Granath Wright trial that there had been no discussion of Wright's tax issues in the December 2014 phone call, again undermining his June 2021 and November 2021 interviews. If the waters weren't murky enough already, they were churned up even more during Craig Wright's cross-examination for the Kleiman v. Wright trial. Counsel: "And in January 2014, you emailed someone named Stephen Matthews a Hotwire investor pack, correct?" "Right. I certainly did, yes." This, of course, throws a grenade under Matthews' claim that he and Wright didn't reconnect until the end of that year, and it wasn't until Matthews' witness statement for the Cope v. Wright case in 2023 that an explanation was forthcoming. "In late 2013, Dr. Wright called me. My mobile phone went off on my desk in the Philippines. It was an unknown number. Sometimes I answer those calls, sometimes I don't. This time, I answered the call and the voice on the other end of the line was Dr. Wright's. He told me he heard I was going to be in Australia for New Year's Eve. He asked whether there was a chance I'd like to meet with him and have a chat." Matthews' news story mirrored his Granath Wright testimony in almost every particular, but backdated the whole thing by a year. According to Matthews, the hotel lobby meeting between himself, Wright, and Ramona Watts took place not on the 2nd of January 2015, but on the 2nd of January 2014, where, again, Ramona mentioned Bitcoin, but Matthews refused to discuss it. As in his Granath Wright testimony, Matthews claimed that Wright made no mention of his company troubles during the meeting. This isn't a surprise, however, because in January 2014 they hadn't really started. In his new testimony, Matthews made the case as to why he was sure that the trip had taken place in 2014 and not the year after. "I travelled with my partner at the time, who is now my wife, to Sydney. We visited family and stayed in a hotel in North Sydney. It was the first time I'd seen Sydney fireworks for New Year's Eve live." It seems that Matthews' memory regarding once-in-a-lifetime events is about as shabby as it is with other areas, unless Sydney's New Year's Eve fireworks aren't that memorable. Matthews' story isn't just undermined by his own flip-flopping. It is also undermined by Craig Wright's version of events. In his first witness statement for the Cope v. Wright case, Wright gave his account of 2014 and 2015. "In 2014, I contacted Stephen via email and phone, informing him about my various business ventures. Given his significant expertise, I intended to contact Stephen to explore potential investment avenues. We engaged in multiple discussions throughout 2014 and the early part of 2015, focusing on the business models and research undertakings of my companies." There are, of course, glaring inconsistencies between Wright's and Matthews' versions of events, suggesting a surprising lack of pre-trial story coordination. Wright's story made no mention of a December 2013 phone call, backing up Coper's narrative that the first contact between the pair since 2010 had been in late 2014. This, of course, clashes with Matthews' claims of a 2nd of January 2014 meeting, but worse was to come for Matthews. In ripping a crucial meeting from 2015 and stitching it into the previous year, Matthews left a massive hole in his 2015 narrative, with the December 2014 phone call and 2nd of January 2015 meeting now fully erased from history. Matthew's new claim that he and Wright didn't speak between early 2014 and April 2015 ran contrary to 2 years' worth of interviews and courtroom testimony, which was suddenly rendered obsolete. Matthew's hapless changes in story between 2021 and 2024 led to Justice Mellor referring him to the Crown Prosecution Service, CPS, so that they can consider whether he should be prosecuted for perjury. The question that needs to be asked here, of course, is why Matthews engaged in such drastic and potentially criminal changes of story. The rationale came in his Coper v. Wright witness statement, where Matthews said that a 3rd of February 2014 email had been uncovered which refreshed my memory of the date of those events in Sydney. The email in question was sent by Matthews to Robert McGregor, CEO of Canadian remittance payment company Entrust, an individual who had come to play a huge part in Craig Wright's life in the years to come. The email saw Matthews introduce Wright to McGregor, suggesting that McGregor might find Wright's research on virtual currencies of interest. He didn't, however, mention anything about Wright having created the father of them all, despite stating in a February 2023 tweet that Craig spent almost 18 months telling me what he was designing in 2007 and 2008. As Jonathan Hoff pointed out during the Coper v. Wright trial, Wright's status as Bitcoin inventor would have been a huge selling point to any potential investor in Bitcoin-related solutions, and yet the connection was never mentioned. The reason for this, as Hoff put to Matthews, was a simple one. Wright hadn't yet decided to don the Satoshi mask. Such a thought can't have been far from Wright's mind, however, given that just 8 days later he sent that email to Louis Kleiman announcing himself as part of Team Satoshi. Matthews' email to McGregor saw him state that he had met with Wright last Friday. This would have been the 31st of January 2014, a date inconsistent with Matthews' story for the Coper v. Wright case, where he said he didn't hear from Wright between 2010 and late 2014. Wright's claim that he and Matthews had engaged in a series of phone calls and emails throughout 2014 also plays havoc with Matthews' testimony that, after the introduction to McGregor in February 2014, we didn't speak or engage any contact until around April 2015. Thankfully, we don't have to rely on Matthews' shoddy memory to cobble together the timeline of this period, as we have a paper trail and testimony from more reliable sources to map out what took place. There is no written record of further discussions between Wright and Matthews following McGregor's rebuff, a period during which Wright would have been preoccupied with trying to keep the ATO at arm's length. Mark Eglinton's book, Hero Villain, Satoshi, the Man Who Built Bitcoin, published in 2024 and funded by Wright's then backers, agrees with CoinGeek regarding the next contact. Eglinton writes that this took place in April 2015 and gives us an evocative description of the supposed interaction. "What do you want to do?" Matthews asked him. "What do you want?" he added, while staring directly into the centre of Wright's soul down the telephone line. It was the magic question, and Wright had the answer. "I don't want to run a business anymore," Wright began. "I just want to create. I want to create for the rest of my life, and I want other people to run businesses and other people to take my creations and do important things with them," he continued. If this sounds familiar, it is because we've already come across it. Matthews said on multiple occasions in 2021 that this conversation took place not over the phone in April 2015, but during the pair's first face-to-face meeting weeks earlier. Clearly, one of these accounts is fabricated, but it's not clear which. One thing we know for sure is that, prior to Wright and Matthews reconnecting in any serious way, Wright embarked on a final roll of the dice to try and make his companies seem more attractive to outside investors. He had wrapped what was left of them, including those that were going through liquidation, into an already established entity, De Morgan Holdings. In an investment pack, De Morgan pitched itself as a company working on alternative currency, next-generation banking and reputational and educational products, detailing all the work it was supposedly doing at the time and what its future plans were. Included in the pack was a balance sheet which put the company's assets at $263 million, a rather optimistic valuation, given that the ATO would report later that year that De Morgan had no employees, no contractors, and had undertaken no R&D activity. Wright was clearly trying to portray the company and its subsidiaries in a flattering light, something he continued into the Coper v. Wright trial, where he suggested that the only reason he needed money at that time was to help fund the over $60 million a year in running costs his Bitcoin work was eating up. This claim, though, is undermined by the many comments made by various people over the state of Wright's companies, such as Stephen Matthews' contentions in interviews and witness testimony, backed up by emails from the time, that Wright's staffing levels had been decimated due to his crippling financial issues. We can be certain of contact between the pair in April 2015 thanks to an email sent by Wright to Matthews on the 17th of that month, with Wright's lawyer, Andrew Sommer, and barrister, Hayden Miller, copied in. The email concerned a meeting Wright was planning to schedule with Matthews over a possible investor following earlier discussions. I have exchanged emails with Stefan over the last fortnight, and he has a complete financial breakdown of the group and of the R&D we are doing. I had my second call today concerning investment. This has resulted in a further follow-up on Monday and a face-to-face meeting with Stefan here in Sydney next week. Finally, we have the opportunity to apply some facts to this period in time. From early April 2015, and possibly beyond, Matthews had been discussing with Wright the idea of investing in his businesses. The email also proves that no face-to-face meetings took place until after this date, blowing out of the water Matthews and CoinGeek's claims of such discussions between the pair in 2014. Wright and his team convened an in-house meeting on the 27th of April to go through the contents of the investor pack for Matthews, including revenue projections, a development roadmap, and insights into the company's work on e-learning and e-finance. This was ahead of the sit-down with Matthews, which was slated to take place sometime in May. Wright asked Sommer and Miller to attend with him, adding that he was going to try to solicit a loan from Matthews with which to fight the ATO and release some of the locked rebates. He would also, he added, seek an additional $2 million in investment, telling the pair that the interest from Matthews was as positive as one can hope for right now. Faced with this evidence during the Cooper v. Wright trial, Wright denied that the discussions with Matthews had been about investment in his companies at all. Wright said he had been hoping to sell some of his Bitcoin stash to another attendee, who wasn't included in the invitation, because he wasn't able to sell the quantity I needed on market. This third person will be discussed in the next chapter, but Wright added that, aside from selling Bitcoins, he wanted to show off what we were doing and how this would actually be good for this third party's online gambling company. This explanation, of course, bore no resemblance to anything discussed in the emails or in the investor pack, and it puts Wright at odds with all the others who attended the May 2015 meeting. This includes, tellingly, Stephen Matthews, who was as surprised as anyone when he heard this explanation during the Cooper v. Wright trial. Counsel. So if somebody was to say that the only purpose of this meeting and these discussions at that time was the sale and purchase of Bitcoins, you disagree? Matthews. Sale and purchase of Bitcoins? Counsel. Yes. Matthews. No, that's not true. There are few certainties over this May 2015 meeting between Wright and Matthews, but its importance cannot be underestimated. It was the spark that lit the dumpster fire of Craig Wright's decade-long Satoshi cosplay. Stephen Matthews claimed during his June 2021 interview that, in the lead-up to the get-together, he had a premonition. I don't know why, but I just thought to myself, he's going to talk to me about Bitcoin. At the time of this interview, of course, Matthews hadn't yet had his memory refreshed by the February 2014 McGregor email, meaning he was publicly maintaining that he hadn't spoken to Wright since 2010. In reality, of course, he had marketed Wright to Robert McGregor 15 months beforehand, and likely stayed in touch with him ever since. We should also remember that Matthews was, at the time of this interview, being very vocal about having been on the receiving end of Wright's Bitcoin pitches in 2007 and 2008, so it would hardly have been a shock for the subject to have come up. These facts also throw into doubt an action he told the court in Granath v. Wright that he said he performed ahead of the meeting. And I googled Bitcoin, and, to my amazement, it was a totally different beast to what I even saw in London. Matthews went even more overboard in his description of this event for CoinGeek. Before the meeting, Matthews finally got around to googling Bitcoin, which led him to a copy of the white paper. Sitting at his computer in his hotel room, Matthews realised he'd seen this document before. It was like I was in a room with a ghost. The fucking hair on the back of my neck tingled. Unlike Matthew's neck hair, this dramatic event obviously doesn't stand up, given the myriad of ways in which Matthews supposedly knew of Wright's connection to Bitcoin. Let's also not forget that Matthews explained in the very CoinGeek piece that makes this extraordinary claim that Matthews and he had talked non-stop about Bitcoin in the 2nd of January 2015 meeting. It is unthinkable, therefore, that Matthews would have had such a visceral reaction to something he had known about for years and discussed just 3 months previously. According to Matthews' June 2021 interview and Coper v. Wright testimony, he travelled to Sydney in early May 2015 and spent the morning signing his divorce papers before meeting Wright later on back at his hotel. Much to Matthews' surprise, Wright was accompanied by 2 individuals. Not Sommer and Miller, but De Morgan's project manager, Alan Pedersen, and the company's director of research, Stefan Savannah. According to Savannah, he and Pedersen dominated the discussion, extolling the virtues of Wright's various companies and detailing the work they were doing, something to which Matthews has also attested. Wright, meanwhile, spent most of the meeting on his phone and did not say very much. The lunch meeting dragged into mid-afternoon, leading to Matthews asking to break it off. Wright, however, was not done, asking for a private meeting, which led to him and Matthews agreeing to meet again for dinner a few hours later. According to his Coper v. Wright testimony, the break gave Matthews the chance to conduct some research. After the lunch, I went upstairs to do some emails. I started Googling Bitcoin. I read about what had occurred since 2009. I read lots about Satoshi Nakamoto. This was the first time I remember coming across that name. I found the white paper and reread the front page. It was a very strange moment, almost like I'd seen a ghost. If this sounds familiar, again, it is because Matthews was supposed to have had this spectral experience before the meeting, not at half-time, which was when he was now saying it had happened. Matthews stuck to this story for the trial 7 months later, where he wasn't questioned on the change, but this alteration is one reason why it is questionable whether this second meeting actually took place. Hero Villain details a heavily romanticised version of the dinner engagement, where Matthews, fresh from his ethereal encounter, was told in true Clint Eastwood style, "You're looking at him," when he asked Wright to confirm who Satoshi Nakamoto was, having apparently just made the connection in his hotel room, setting aside all his supposed extant knowledge. This is almost certainly too Hollywood to be true, as is what Eglinton reports the pair discussing. The 2 men then discussed Wright's early days of mining bitcoins in the cattle shed of his farm in the New South Wales countryside, his reasoning behind the Satoshi Nakamoto pseudonym, and the extent of the research that had been undertaken since Satoshi stepped away from day-to-day public Bitcoin conversation in 2010. This tale is almost certainly apocryphal, given that, as we know from the emails arranging it, the purpose of the meeting was Matthews' consideration of Wright and his companies as an investment opportunity. It is much more likely that Matthews, having been on the end of a 3-hour sales pitch in the morning, wanted to hear about Wright's financial issues from the horse's mouth. Indeed, Wright was probably happy to part ways after the sales pitch, but Matthews wanted to cut through the bullshit and find out where the bodies were buried. Matthews stated in his very first interview on the subject in May 2021 that the pair had spent the dinner discussing Bitcoin, a story resuscitated for CoinGeek's How Bitcoin Was Saved, but in all his other interviews and courtroom appearances, Matthews ditched this in favour of a claim that he and Wright had a long and detailed discussion about Wright's issues with the ATO and his company's cash flow problems. Wright also told Matthews that De Morgan was, in Matthews' later words, in fairly advanced discussions with Australia's Macquarie Bank over a supposed $40 million 4-year investment which would allow De Morgan to resolve its tax issues. Wright was pressed on the legitimacy of this purported deal during the Coper v. Wright trial, where he said he had submitted evidence of the proposal to his lawyers, but, for some reason, it had not been used in his defence. Given the atrocious quality of the evidence that Wright's representatives did submit in his defence, one can only imagine how bad this particular batch must have been. According to Matthews' June 2021 interview, it was during this dinner that he asked Wright his magic question of what Wright wanted to do with his life, with Wright responding that he would like to complete the research that had been in his head for 15 to 20 years. He could only do this, he said, if he had a role as head of research rather than as CEO of a company. This incident is a perfect example of the level of misinformation present in this element of the story. in May 2021, Matthews recounted how this conversation happened over the phone in December 2014. In his next interview, it happened at the May 2015 dinner meeting, and in Hero Villain, it happened in the weeks in between, again over the phone. Clearly, either some or all of these recollections are untrue, but once again, we simply don't know which. These discrepancies add more weight to the notion that the second meeting never happened. Stefan Savannah confirmed to us that he, Wright, Pedersen and Matthews indeed met for lunch, where a pitch for investment was made, but he was not able to confirm that a later meeting happened between Wright and Matthews. However many meetings took place, and whatever was discussed in them, once they were over, the attendees all went their separate ways, with Wright and his entourage hoping that they had impressed Matthews enough to elicit investment and save the business. Matthews himself had a decision to make. I flew home to Manila the next morning, and I sat at home and I thought to myself, how am I going to approach this? Just like Craig reached out to me and said, I need somebody to talk to, I thought the same. I thought, I need to talk to somebody who will be able to relate to the situation that I'm going to explain to them. And I called a friend of mine, Calvin Ayre.